Shadiversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and this is a follow-up video talking about what medieval weapons would a Minotaur really use if they actually existed. And the reason why I'm making this video is that I feel there is far more to cover than I was able to address in my original. Generally, I've found the more I think of a subject, the more ideas come to my mind, and when enough ideas come that I feel that the original videos I've made haven't done justice to the overall topic, I do feel prompted to make a second follow-up. The other time I did this was when I made a follow-up video to my realism and practicality review of the Imperial City from Oblivion. One of my other favourite things about all my videos is the discussion that is created in the comments section. And honestly guys, so often you come up with just some brilliant ideas that either inspire me or is the catalyst for me developing my own additional thoughts on the subjects. So I also want to address some of the comments that you guys have mentioned in response to that video, which I feel were really insightful and worth talking about. The first one that was raised more than once was in regards to the Minotaur's eyesight, that in regular cows, their eyes are on the sides of their heads, which affect very much depth perception and forward-facing vision. The thing is, I don't actually feel that applies with Minotaurs. You see, when you look at Minotaurs, how they are depicted artistically, their eyes are never on the side of their head to the extent that they are on real cows. Sorry, bulls, if we're going to be specific. You will find that their eyes are more so on the side of their heads than a regular human, but they are very much facing forward. These are forward-facing eyes, just a bit more on the side, which in fact, I actually think this would increase a Minotaur's field of vision more so than a human's. Now, their center line would be masked a little bit on the inward side of each eye because of their more bulbous kind of nose. But that would only affect things, say, within 10 centimeters in front of their face. Anything further, I think they would be able to see very clearly. So in actual fact, when looking at how Minotaurs have been depicted artistically, yeah, I actually think their eyesight would be superior to humans and have a much wider field of vision on the sides. The next question that has arisen in regards to Minotaurs using bows was, would their horns get in the way of the bowstring? For myself, I don't actually think so, just because when you pull a bow back to full draw, the string doesn't actually pass the head. You pull the string just to a bit to the side of the head and the eye, and from where the horns are positioned on a Minotaur, they look to be on the back of the head or, behind the eyes, which means the bowstring wouldn't actually reach the horn at all, even in full draw. Though I will admit this point does depend a bit on the size and shape of the horns. There are some Minotaur horns that are so big and so far facing forward, I could see, perhaps that it gets in the way of the string, but more generally, I think a Minotaur would be safe. And see, it's things like this that I love considering, and I'm kind of kicking myself that I didn't, address them in the original video. And even before uploading the video, I felt like that there was more I could speak on, but it just didn't come to my mind at the time. And because these things are so interesting, follow-up video, and this is awesome. I love this stuff. The next important point to consider is their intelligence, and this one was a bit too undefined in my mind because it really depends on the fantasy. There are so many fantasies where Minotaurs appear to be equally as intelligent as humans, and so many where they are depicted as brutish beasts and even being far less intelligent than orcs. And so that one really depends on the fantasy, and I do fully admit if Minotaurs are brutish beasts, it's very unlikely they would have the, know-how or technology to build such an oversized sword, because this is the thing, they would actually need to make a bearing sword. Bearing swords were so rare that it would be very unlikely that the Minotaur just happened to find one that was so suited for him. Because that's where I'd think Minotaurs would have to find their weapons if they couldn't make the weapons themselves. They would take them and pick them up from the corpses of the adventurers they killed, and in that regard, I think what they would generally end up using wouldn't necessarily be the axes. I think they'd want to find weapons that were better suited to their size, and remember, they're at least a foot bigger than humans, so I actually think they'd end up picking up the great swords, the long swords or great swords, war swords also, and using them in one hand. So perhaps in regards to swords, and if Minotaurs can't make their weapons, they would be more inclined to using one-handed swords of huge sizes in comparison to a human. To them, they would be just kind of really, really big arming swords, but because they're so much stronger, and their ratio of strength seems to be greater in regards to their size, I feel like that they could also handle much larger one-handed swords in comparison to the size than we can as humans. So yeah, throwing around great swords in one hand, perhaps. But then if the Minotaurs are capable of making their own weapons, I think my thoughts on the bows and the bearing swords are still a good pick for them. But that is very much dependent, like I was talking about, in regards to the type of opponents they're fighting, and there is another factor that I didn't talk about, which I wish I did, so I'll address it here, and that is their actual physical environment. And many of you guys were very keen and clued on to point out that one of the main environments that Minotaurs seem to be in is actually the labyrinth, especially from the classic Greek mythology. The origin of the Minotaur is in a labyrinth. And a labyrinth is a bit different to a cave. You see, people were trying to bring up this objection in regards to dwarves, and that dwarves live underground, which inferred to them meant confined spaces, and therefore they needed a bit shorter weapons, and that kind of justified in their mind the axes. But my own thought in regards to that, whenever you see dwarven either caves or their cities and stuff like that, they are massive in comparison to the dwarves. Dwarves seem to, in regards to building things, dwarves love to go big, and they're really small. Is it a compromise? I don't know. Are they trying to compensate? But their caves, their tunnels, and especially their great halls are huge. Dwarves never really struck me as being limited for space, even in underground. So I didn't really think that was a restrictive factor. But in regards to Minotaurs, well, here I am absolutely willing to make this concession. I do think there is validity in this point. And being restricted in space, well, really big long swords, one-handed swords they might still be able to get away with them, but big bearing swords, that would be far less effective. Very hard to swing that blade around. And so in considering this fact, I was also thinking about if I should have spoken more on armor in my original video. Minotaurs are rarely ever shown wearing armor, so there's obviously different perspectives we can approach this, because if they're clever enough to make bearing swords, they'd be clever enough to make armor as well, which would also justify the use of the bearing swords, and they'd have no need for shields. The other question is, do Minotaurs need armor? Well, I think they have tougher hides than humans, but of course, armor is always better than not. Yet still, Minotaurs are rarely ever depicted actually wearing armor, so I actually think this might play into or give us a bit more of a guiding line as to how intelligent they are, depending on the fantasy as well, because say Chronicles of Narnia, the Minotaurs are not only using big two-handed swords in some cases, they are also wearing armor. So again, depending on fantasies, but more often than not, Minotaurs are wearing little armor, or none at all, which does seem to indicate that they don't have the intelligence to make weapons, which means they pick up the weapons from the people they kill. And so those are my thoughts on armor, and then I started to think about shields a bit, and then I started to have an idea of a combat type that would actually really suit them in confined locations, like a labyrinth, and it also plays into what appears to be a very natural inclination for them to want to charge, and they're always depicted as throwing their bullheads down, using their horns, and I stand by what I said there, that I don't think charging with the horns is good at all. It's exposing the head and the neck, potential to get the horns not only stuck in things, but also stuck in the people that they gore and ram, right? And that could be a big issue if there's more than one human this Minotaur is fighting. They ram one human, then they try and stand up, and the human stands up, and the human is stuck on their head, and then the other people are out to get it. So, no, charging with their horns, bad idea. But they have such incredible mass, and their hoofed feet seems to give them an added advantage in building up huge momentum and speed in a forward-moving, trajectory. And I said, they could use their weapon while in a charge, and I mentioned maybe a lance, but a lance was a one hit. But now I've just realized there's another kind of a weapon that could work really well in a charge, and the Minotaur's added mass and momentum would benefit it massively. And that is a really big shield. And ideally, it would be like a tower shield. And could you imagine in a close, confined either cave or labyrinth, a Minotaur standing in front of you, basically blocking the entire passageway. You can't get past this thing, and then he has a really big shield in front of him. And then the Minotaur just charges with the shield right in front. And you can't do anything. You can't attack the shield, right? Because the shield is meant to block weapons. And the shield would just ram you, and you'd just get pummeled, knocked off your feet. You'd have no hope. You can't duck to the sides. Yet the only option you'd have would be to try and run away. But can you outrun a Minotaur? It doesn't seem like you would be able to. It seems like their full stride length is it would actually be wider than humans, which means that they would be able to run a lot faster than humans. So you wouldn't be able to outrun these guys. And then with the mass, the momentum behind this shield that they're holding, you get trampled. You'd get hit by the shield, he could run right over you, or just after knocking you down, have this is actually interesting. This is where actually using a shorter sword is more advantageous than using a longer one. Now, I mean, there's a very important reason why the Romans used the gladius with their tower shields and they didn't use longer swords. You see, the gladius being shorter made it a more convenient weapon to use behind such a big shield. So you can easily take the sword up above the shield and stab over or stab around, where if the blade was longer, you would have to pull your arm much further back to bring the sword behind the shield and still have the point facing forward. Which is, of course, more awkward, and the other reason why you don't need such a longer sword when you have a really big shield is that you can use the shield to cover and protect yourself to close the distance. Longer bladed swords are very advantageous for their increased reach, which means you can strike and try and keep your body, at a safer distance from your opponent, which isn't an issue with such a shield. So the shield enables you to get in right in close, okay, almost body to body, but the shield in between you and your opponent, and then just using that sword to stab up and around, it's a deadly combo. And for a Minotaur, in a labyrinth kind of thing, a shorter sword in comparison to his size, which would probably still be arming sword at least, but something give it a bit more heft, more chopping because it's stronger. So yeah, then we would be looking at the falchion or mesa kind of sword, but a big kind of one-handed one in comparison to us, but appropriately sized for the Minotaur. And so best weapon combo for a Minotaur in a labyrinth, in a cave, I actually think tower shield and decent beefy sword. The question is, could a Minotaur get those weapons if they are the brutish beast? Well, they might be able to get their hands on a tower shield, but also shields are not that difficult to make. I even think because the Minotaur is obviously smart enough to pick up a weapon and use it. He might not be smart enough to make it from scratch, but if he's smart enough to pick up something and use it, well, there is a very common flat board type of object that the Minotaur would be able to find very readily and pick up and use it. And it's called the doors, all right? The standard human-sized door would always be the perfect-sized tower shield for a Minotaur. So a Minotaur just has to waltz into some village or something like that, rip off a door from its hinges, and he's got his tower shield, kill a human somewhere, anywhere, and he's got his one-handed weapon. And, you know, that could be the axe. I will admit that in this context, the axe could fit fine, because an axe has a shorter range, all right? And that means it would work really well behind a big shield, kind of like how the gladius does. So now, having reassessed this question, looking at in a more broader context, I actually feel the best weapon pick for a Minotaur would be a tower shield, meaning a door that they've ripped off someone's home, okay? And then it's pretty easy enough to engineer some type of handhold. He could just rip through the door, kind of, you know, door on either side, rip out some of the planks, or so, kind of, to make a handhold in the middle, and he's got his massive tower shield. And I like this weapon pick so much more. It suits the Minotaur, and he can use it in his charges. He can use it in his labyrinths and his caves. And even outside of the cave, in open ground, having a massive tower shield like this is a huge advantage. And would the Minotaur carry around a tower shield? I think he would, because a Minotaur is a monster. He's looking to fight people. It seems like the Minotaurs are the ones initiating the fight, which means they wouldn't be carrying around weapons purely for self-defense on the off chance you get in trouble. They would be carrying around weapons for the purpose of fighting, which means you can include the battlefield weapons in this analogy. And yeah, tower shield, absolutely. And on the open battlefield, they're still really useful, and they can still do their massive charges with this big old shield in front of them and just trample, knock down people completely, so much mass, and they have their weapon, whatever it be, and it could be an axe. Because the tower shield answers that glaring problem that I pointed out that axes have in historical combat, and it's that they have such poor defensive capabilities. But shield covers the defense perfectly, so the axe now comes back into the picture, and very well could be a good suited pick for a Minotaur. So maybe this is one of those rare occasions where the iconic classical weapon of a fantasy creature actually can fit if it's put in the right context. Just not the two-handed axes that they are so often depicted in using for the reasons that I explained in my previous video. And separate to axes, then of course, great picks for the Minotaur are still big beefy swords. Big falchion or messer or something like that and just hack people to death. So there you go, I'm really glad we've taken a second look at the Minotaur, and thank you guys for prompting me to do so. Thank you for the questions you've risen and also bringing to light ideas that I hadn't considered. Love this stuff, I love the discussion, hope you've enjoyed, hope to see you again, and until that time, farewell.